Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Cargill's new series, People in Science Live, streaming on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. I'm Francesca Brazzorotto, your host, and today I'm honored to welcome our very first and very special guest, Professor Nicholas Dirks. Hello, Professor Dirks.
Hello, Francesca.
For those of you in Europe or generally outside of the US who might not be too familiar with American academic life, Professor Dirks is the president and CEO of the New York Academy of Science. He's a prominent academic and a thought leader in the fields of history, anthropology, and higher education. And what's even more important for our talk today is that he has worked closely with researchers and the research environment across his many roles. In fact, he served as the 10th Chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley from 2013 to 2017. And before that, he was the Executive Vice President and Dean of the Faculty of the Arts and Sciences at Columbia University, where he played a pivotal role in interdisciplinary, international, and diversity initiatives. Therefore, he has a profound understanding of the challenges facing modern academia, especially in areas like research integrity and the ethical dimensions of scientific inquiry. He's also the author of City of Intellect, a compelling book that serves as part memoir of his student and professional life and part exploration of the complex interplay between knowledge, ethics, and the institutional frameworks of universities in America. Today, using his experience and book as a reference, we'll delve into the critical issues such as trust in science, the integrity of research practices, and the impact of unethical practices such as paper mills, for example, on the academic publishing industry. Our conversation aims to uncover the challenges and potential solutions to ensuring that scientific research remains a trusted and ethical endeavor. So let's get started. Professor Dirks, in your book, you talk about your various roles in academia and how you have dedicated much of your time working within the research system in a way, and you have touched upon the various ethical dimensions of academia. So it could be argued that in general, researchers' actions are influenced more by training and incentives that they can receive within the system rather than by abstract ethical principles. How do you think training and incentives affect the honesty of research today, and what can we do to encourage more ethical research practices?
Sure. And this is a really important question because, as you say, the kinds of frameworks within which people work for university research and pursue their interests and try to make discoveries and advance our knowledge, nevertheless comes along with certain kinds of incentives, as you say, that include, for example, just the need to publish. And if you don't publish, you, as the saying goes, will perish. So in the first instance, you have to do research. You have to do research that can make a difference. You have to find ways to publicize that research. And you have to build on that and develop a kind of research profile in order to do two things. One is to actually get the kind of security of position in a university or research institute. And secondly, of course, because that's how you get grants. And the funding environment is incredibly important for all of this because frequently you get a grant from a funding agency, usually in the United States, the NSF or NIH, but also other funding agencies as well, on the basis of previous research. And that previous research has to be published in order really to be taken seriously. Now, there's a good reason for that, because when you publish, you get a peer review, you get the imprimatur of the journal and the kinds of other research work that is represented in that. But of course, it raises all kinds of questions about incentives when, for example, you are having trouble getting published. And I'm sure you might ask me a question or two about that.
Thank you. That's absolutely true. And I think you refer in your book, you refer to another book called Publish and Perish by James Hines. And we always hear about publish or perish, which is what researchers usually say when we talk about being published in our journals. In this book you're kind of quoting, for those of you who have not read it, the characters in the novellas are often depicted as desperate to secure tenure and recognition, and they really reflect the real-world pressure on academics to publish extensively and achieve this professional success. And I think, Professor, you had the same experience when it was your turn to get a job within the university. So these extreme actions of the characters in this book kind of highlight the absurdity and sometimes the destructive nature of this pressure. So this ties well with the question of this need to constantly work and publish in certain journal. And one of the most pressing issues connected to that, which is kind of the rise of paper mills, and which undermine the credibility of scientific research by producing this fraudulent publication or even conferences. So what do you believe are the long-term impacts of paper mills on the credibility of scientific research? And how do you think the academic community effectively can combat this problem to restore this trust in published and peer-reviewed studies?
So the question of trust is a big one, and it's really become, I think, quite urgent for us to take very, very seriously, because we've seen in the general population an increasing skepticism about science, about recent scientific research, certainly about things that relate to vaccines. We saw very powerfully during the pandemic. And yet it's threatening to undermine even the work that is being done across countries across the globe to combat, for example, climate change. When people say, "Oh, I don't believe it because, we were told that we had to scrub down our packages during COVID in the early days, and nobody told us that it was going to be airborne," and then all of a sudden they changed their mind. Of course, that's how science works. It does change its mind. It changes its mind on the basis of research and discovery, and that, of course, is what is critical. But in order for that to generate the kind of trust that is needed, not only across the scientific community but outside it, I think we do have to, take very seriously some of the kinds of questions that have been raised. In the first instance, I just want to flag for discussion here the fact, I think, that we don't always do it perfectly. So we have peer review, but we also have articles that are published periodically that have issues that require retraction. We do have peer review, but it is also sometimes the case that when people see that you got your PhD from a particular institution, they might have a confirmation bias of some sort and think your work is necessarily better because of where you went to school. And all of those things then, create, I think, two issues. One, a certain kind of skepticism, but two, a real problem for people who don't necessarily have the kind of networks that allow them easy access to top journals or invitations to top conferences and so on and so forth. So I'm just saying that because I want to create a context for why it is that there, I think, were some good efforts, even as there have been efforts across social media to provide other kinds of outlets for people to get their name out there and get their work out there. That being said, there's a reason why some of these journals are called predatory, and that is because they take advantage of people precisely who are desperate to get their work out. They take advantage of a bunch of things, including the whole movement towards open access, where frequently the journal will ask the researcher if they have funds through their research institution or their grant or whatever to make something available to everyone for free, so they don't have a paywall when they're actually trying to access that research. And of course, researchers want their work to be widely read. And not everybody has access to a major university research library that will make that possible. So, so you begin with the fact that open access requires funding, either from the individual or from their institution. And then all of a sudden you get these other kinds of journals that are going to potential contributors and saying, if you pay this amount of money, we'll publish your paper. Of course, they don't do serious peer review often. They don't tell you ahead of time necessarily what the rates are going to be. It's not really for open access because it's basically a kind of scam and a funding model predicated on getting a lot of desperate people to pay money just to have their paper published. And of course, it doesn't confer any great reputational benefit either, because these are journals that sooner or later get identified by people in the field as, if not completely fraudulent, certainly lax in terms of scientific standards. But this is the world we live in, right? Which is one in which people take advantage of this. There's a lot of money to be made if you can put a journal up and get people to pay for it. Unfortunately, a lot of people are taking advantage of a global research world in which not everyone has equal access to the best journals, the best conferences, the best institutions and libraries, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. I think in this answer, you cover so many interesting topics that we should really cover like in 5 or 6 other episodes. But let's start with the first point you made. I think you are working at a great institution like the New York Academy of Science. And going back to you mentioned COVID and how difficult it was to publish articles, and sometimes science changes and there were some retractions. I mean, it happens when science is moving so fast to try and keep up with what's going on in the world. And COVID was such an incredible time to be a science, and especially in the health sciences. Do you think there is a responsibility on the side of the institution to check what is being put out there? So I know it's a very fine line that we need to walk there, because also in the book you're talking about the importance of balancing moral concerns with the commitment to sort of neutrality within the academic institution, within the research institution. And I think you mentioned a couple of examples that happened to you while you were working at Berkeley. But I think this balance is very important, especially when it comes to controversial, and we say controversial because this issue might be labeled as such, when we're talking about something that has political or governmental pressure, like the vaccinations during COVID. So what do you think are, how can university balance the need to address these moral and ethical concerns with this research, with the commitment to stay neutral and the free speech and academic freedom, especially, in the face of a market and political pressures that may arise within and without the research environment? So when is allowing for freedom of research, and when are we bordering to censorship, so to speak?
That's a really great question. And the truth is that, institutions will hire faculty or researchers on the basis of their track record. But then they will give them a certain degree of freedom to conduct the research they want to conduct, as long as they can find the funding to support it. And they don't. Frequently, certainly administrators in these universities don't intervene to say you should do X as opposed to Y. And if somebody is interested in something that has political controversy attached to it, could be vaccine work, although nobody actually anticipated at the beginning of the pandemic that vaccines were going to become such a hot political issue. But it could be, for example, research about fossil fuels, about issues related, in earlier eras to the health effects of tobacco or the health effects of something else. Mm-hmm. In all of those instances, there can be political pressures that are brought to bear on universities to, for example, there are universities in the U.S. that are named after, tobacco companies, for example, or families that got their fortune from tobacco. So, you need to be able to, as an institution, to maintain what I called neutrality in the book. I think probably a better word for that is impartiality, because neutrality suggests that you never get involved in a dispute, and in fact, of course, universities do. They get involved, among other things, also because they champion a certain set of moral and ethical principles, even at the same time that they want to support free speech and academic freedom. So maybe impartiality is better, but in any event, I think the general history in the U.S. around academic freedom has given a great deal of authority to the academic profession. And so when we talk about peer review with respect to journal publication, we're really, in fact, referencing the importance of the scientific community and the community of one's peers, in other words, in that professional activity, whether it's a peer group of chemists or physicists or biologists, or for that matter, in my case, historians and anthropologists. You're basically doing is saying they're going to be the ones who are going to decide what is important. They're the ones who are experts, and therefore they're the ones who are going to make the judgments about what is important research and so on. And they'll be asked to report about that, whether it's reference they're giving about a paper that's been submitted for publication, or whether it's for a tenure case or a promotion case or an appointment case or what have you. So that's been the tendency within academia, which is, of course, to accord to that group that kind of authority. But with authority goes responsibility. And I think we always have to, and this is, of course, where the question of ethics comes in, I think, at the level of the university, we always have to be attentive to the importance of, genuinely hearing from people who don't have personal connections, who are not part of the same network necessarily, who take their responsibility to adjudicate these kinds of questions very, very seriously, and will give impartial judgments about its importance. And something where the university does have a role and can, I think, actually exert some influence and needs to attend to this larger concern about the ethical and moral context within which we operate, because we have to be concerned about the fact that we don't always do it right. And that's why ethical and moral guidelines can be very, very useful in helping to ensure that we do publish the very best work. We do identify the very best people doing work and so on and so forth in areas that are really important. And we, we don't get kind of caught up in just, business as usual and think that, if it's X, who's applying for this, then they should definitely get the grant without necessarily reading and really scrutinizing the work carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. It just feels like the whole system for researchers is a bit broken. Is a bit, I wouldn't say rigged, but a bit broken. I feel like they are forced to do so much research. They are forced to publish so much research. At the same time, there's especially for what I could see, like in America, there seems to be a lot of lobbying when it comes to, topics. I don't know if it's the same in Europe. I'm not qualified to say, but I just feel it's a very American thing to have this sort of lobbying going on when it comes to this subject. So what do you think should be attempted to change this system? Because we do have a lot going on when it comes to open access, for example, that is trying to change the way that research is being evaluated, right? So we have journals impact factors and things like that. And we're trying to move away from there to say, you don't have to publish in that specific journal in order for your research to be, important. It could be like a different journal. It doesn't have to be, on a high impact factor journal. But at the same time, what do you think is going to happen in academia to move away from this system of you really need to publish as much as possible in order for your score to go up and in order for you to have a career? Because that seems to be the root of all evils, because even people that have, want to do things properly cannot keep up with this pace, cannot keep up with all this publishing. And might end up doing, things they're not supposed to be doing. And the research integrity then goes out of the window. So what do you think? What do you propose that can change in academia?
This is a hard one. And there are a lot of people who are thinking about this. And, I'm simply in contact constantly, certainly in my life here in the New York Academy of Sciences, with people who are genuinely concerned to make sure that really talented young people are brought into the scientific world, given the opportunity to not only explore their interest, but also given the freedom to do things that might, swerve a little bit outside the main lane and do things that really end up with major discoveries. We know, from the great philosophical and historical work of Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that we sometimes work within, and he called it normal science, a particular paradigm. And every now and then you get a Newton or an Einstein or somebody comes along and throws that paradigm, if not out the window, certainly at an angle, so that you all of a sudden begin to see the importance of other kinds of things that you can begin to explore. So you want to have a world in which there can be opportunity, but also a world in which there can be a certain kind of freedom. At the same time, You want a world in which, there is a clear set of guidelines that really do make distinctions between good work and work that is flawed in one way or another. I'd just add one other complexity here, which you didn't ask about, but I think it's relevant. I went to Berkeley as chancellor in 2013, but it was just I first visited in 2012, and that's when Jennifer Doudna, who subsequently got the Nobel Prize along with Emmanuel Charpentier for the work on CRISPR-Cas9, had just come up with her initial discovery of what CRISPR gene editing could do, and it was an amazing discovery. But it did actually become a contentious issue for universities, because there were people working in a lab in the Broad Institute at MIT and to some extent at Harvard, who were also working on this. And so the question of publication became quite fraught, because at some point you had to, it's not just in terms of perishing, but you actually had to get your article published before somebody else's article was published in order to get credit. And of course, universities were filing patents at the same time that these kinds of discoveries were being made. And a lot of money potentially rides on that for universities through technology transfer and IP. So I say that, and of course the story of CRISPR is actually told incredibly well by Walter Isaacson in his book, The Codebreakers, which I highly recommend to people. But it includes in it a really sort of play-by-play account of how different scientists rushed to get work published and thought the other one was publishing too soon or whatever, but doing so in pursuit of the possibility for profit. This is always going to be an issue, because these kinds of discoveries are going to have huge potential. But again, that's where institutions really have to be careful and make sure that they are following certain kinds of ethical principles about the way in which credit is being taken, patents are being applied for, and so on. And I just say that because, again, I don't want to claim that everything is perfect in the way we do things. On the other hand, we do, I think, have to really be concerned about giving people more opportunity. And also considering the possibility that there are other ways to fund research that could help supplement the ways in which our normal science proceeds. There's been a certain literature in the US that goes under the name of meta-science. And what is meant by that, in part, is that some of the kinds of questions scientists are working on now are so important. They really require massive funding that will accelerate the process of scientific discovery. And some of the people who've been writing in this domain say, the problem is there's just not enough money in these federal agencies. And so they've been supportive, for example, of private philanthropists setting up research institutes to help not only supplement funding, but also to give people the opportunity, say, for 10 years, not to write a grant, but to just do their research and to explore what they think is probably most important. So I think that's an important, element of the story, because you do want to have real scope for, broad experimentation. And by the same token, and I'll just say one thing more and then stop for now, but by the same token, we saw in the whole history of social media how exciting it was to open up the possibility for self-publication through blogs and tweets and what have you. When it first, hit the scene over, say 15 years or so ago. And of course, everybody thought this was going to just be great because it was going to allow better access to all kinds of great information. And now what do we see? Well, we see massive disinformation. We see the loss of any kind of community of judgment that is behind the publication of certain kinds of news stories that affects elections, it affects our democracies. And it, of course, at the very least, just sows doubt in people as to whether or not what you hear or what you see or what you read is actually true anymore. So, so you have to hang on to, these communities of judgment that do involve experts and expertise. And you can complain about that being elitist, but you also have to find ways in which you actually can discriminate between those who know something and those who don't.
Yeah, understood. And going back to your, you mentioned the kind of the social consequences of advancement in scientific fields, like, as you said, gene editing as well, and all these concerns with social media and how we use social media, and we use, for example, artificial intelligence as a way of making research and sharing research. Now we have like bots that can share whatever type of fake news out there on social media that help this misinformation and give science communication a bad name sometimes, because you don't know what is real, what is not, what it has some research behind it, or what is just hearsay. And I want to touch on this, on AI and kind of the regulation that kind of should in some way help us using AI and new technology in a way that is beneficial to research and not, helping this spread of misinformation. So how should universities and research institutions address these ethical concerns to ensure responsible innovation? So we're talking about innovation, not just kind of research topics. So how can they help researchers use this sort of new technologies in a way that it's fair, and then it's like the right way to use it?
Yeah, so AI is such an interesting, kind of test case for all of the questions that you've been raising. And that is precisely as you said, because, on the one hand, with the development of neural networks, and then, the increase in the amount of available data on the one side and the massive compute power of GPUs on the other, you've seen this explosion, again, since around 2011, in what artificial intelligence all of a sudden can do. And with the release of OpenAI's ChatGPT, and the proliferation now of LLMs, large language models, since the fall of 2022, we're all talking about AI, and everybody's trying to invest in AI, and they see the AI as both the future of everything we do. It has huge implications for science. It has huge implications, of course, for business, but it has a lot of other implications out there, and there are people who are deeply concerned about it. So there are people who have set up things like at Cambridge University, the Center for Existential Risk, up at MIT, the Future of Life Institute, all concerned with questions of, what AI could do in a nefarious way. My colleague at Berkeley, Stuart Russell, who wrote a book called Human Compatible a few years ago, has been deeply worried about AI when it comes to autonomous weapon systems. And of course, we've seen the use of those in the war in Ukraine. So, there are a lot of justifiable reasons to be concerned. But then, of course, as you were saying before, you also have hallucinations, and you have a very uncertain grasp of the truth when it comes to what AI actually comes up with. And of course, AI comes up with what it gets. I mean, if it's garbage that goes in, it's garbage that comes out. And we have to be really concerned about the data sets we use to train this. Not to mention the fact that data sets have to be, attributed properly, and people whose creative work is effectively being used without any kind of compensation have to be protected. But my chief interest in this is that, AI is, and it's to your question, AI is this massively important new technology. It has incredible potential. It also has dangers that are associated with it. But universities do have an obligation, I think, to help create a kind of ethical framework for thinking about how AI is done. I don't think we can fully trust the tech industries themselves to establish the guardrails they need. After all, they're in it for profit. That's fine. That's how they in fact pay for the huge amount of funding that's how they get the funding they need to get the compute power and the data sets that they require to really advance the technology. But universities can help create ethical frameworks, but they can do more than that. And what they can do, I think, is to call upon all the different disciplines, including the anthropologists and sociologists, as well as the philosophers and ethicists, to help think about what the impact of AI will be, and to really provide a kind of roadmap of potential impacts that nobody really is working on outside of universities. We're working on this at the New York Academy of Sciences. We're creating programs where we're trying to bring university researchers together to do precisely this, because I think it's a huge need and one that does kind of broaden the scope, as it were, of what a ethical kind of approach to AI might consist of.
I think that's really interesting, this approach as to AI from an institutional point of view, because I have just recently, I think it was yesterday, I read this article saying that the main responsibility here should be also with publishers. Okay, so they were asking in this article that publishers of academic journals take more accountability in the use of AI and need to tell researchers exactly how to use them. So I thought that it was okay in some way. I thought this person was right in a way, but also that not all responsibility should lay on the publisher, because obviously the researcher should be the one that should be aware of the risks of the tools they use. But I also think that universities and institutions should have their own responsibility. And I think what you mentioned about ethical framework and creating a roadmap of the impact of the use of LLMs or AI in general in research is such an important part of the whole journey that researchers need to, do in order to use these tools in the right way. So do you agree from your point of view, and do you agree that some responsibility, like the majority of responsibility, should also be with the researchers and some also with the publishers? Or how do you see this kind of sharing of responsibilities work out between these three stakeholders?
So this raises a whole new set of issues for publishers, clearly. But by that same logic, it raises new questions for universities, right? I mean, we're now debating whether there should be a watermark on any given GPT generated or LLM generated text. I don't think publishers really want to publish under the name of one researcher work that was actually done by some LLM that has been consulted by the researcher and then transcribed into the published work. And it's going to be hard to find that, right? I mean, you can right now the LLMs are such that you can probably tell the difference between what is written by a human, what's written by a bot. But how long is that going to be the case as the bots get better and better and the data gets more and more sophisticated? So there is a huge burden that I think does fall on the researcher for this. On the other hand, publishers need to be aware of these issues, and I think universities have to also, think about what might make it more possible, to monitor what's being used. Certainly, in the development of AI, I think a lot of people are thinking about. Certainly, in universities, they're thinking about this: how to have better, citational apparatus for AI, so that you actually have the AI identify, where it got a particular article, argument, or fact, so that you can check it the same way you can use footnotes to check. Referencing, clearly is an important protocol of academic publishing and life, and so we need to find ways to introduce this into AI. But it's a kind of brave new world, right? So that it is taking place, as we see, with enormous power that we haven't, either figured out how to harness or even how fully to understand. And then it gets more complex because we keep hearing from researchers about the black box of AI. They don't always know how to retrace the steps. You create the algorithm, you train it, you have the neural network, but you really don't know what happens inside, to come out with a particular result. Well, that's both fascinating because that's often how humans think, but it's also troubling because you don't know how it came to think this, on the basis of what, and a publisher doesn't necessarily want to have their reputation attached to some mysterious process that there's no way to understand, recover, or ever kind of hold accountable.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us back to the sort of articles published and then retracted, and just made me think of a couple of articles that came out in some journals and had to be retracted because they were obviously created and with some kind of LLMs with images that didn't make any sense. I don't know if you know about the article about a rat with huge genitalia that was published a while ago, and the article was supposed to be peer reviewed, but then obviously wasn't, and then it was retracted. So I think it's a very, very interesting topic, and yeah, and it will be interesting to see how it develops, and what kind of responsibilities all of us as publishers or institutions or researchers will have to what kind of responsibility we have to take on us to do that. Another thing that I really wanted to really touch on was the training of LLMs, because as you said, where are the sources from? And if we look at that, we can see that sometimes, sometimes, the majority of times, we can have some bias into the output of this, of these LLMs, because the source is mainly based on content that comes from what we call the global north. So sources that are really from a specific set of countries, like the UK, the US, Europe in general, and therefore from authors from those countries. So there might be a little bit of a kind of a bias in the results of this creation, of this output. I know that you have studied in India and you went and did your research there. You lived there. I think you took also your family there for a year or two. So you immersed yourself in the reality of India. I just want to ask you, do you think that there is a significant gap between what we call the global north and the global south when it comes to ethical and research integrity issues? Is there like a divide or a gap? And do you think we can create a scholarly environment or an ecosystem that can involve both of them in the same way?
So in the first instance to your question, I think that it is clear there is a kind of gap between the global north and the global south, or however you want to kind of position this, and in making the distinctions between places that have lots of resources and lots of institutions that have been concerned about a lot of these issues for a very long time, and those that don't. And from the very beginning of LLMs, we've seen that you get just unbelievable instances of bias that gets reflected, whether it's bias about skin color, whether it's bias about gender, whether it's bias about any number of other things. You realize that the data sets contain a lot of problematic things because they come from human activity and human thought and human stuff, and then you get it back, and then you get it back as something that is ostensibly neutral, ostensibly true because it's not being processed by an individual who has particular biases, but of course it has huge amounts of bias, and so it's even more potentially destructive. And a wonderful book by Brian Christian called The Alignment Problem has covered a lot of instances there, which I highly recommend. But again, to the second part of your question, which is how to think about the future of research integrity globally, I have a great deal of confidence that places like India, where there are a number of superb institutions, both of higher education and also of research, and where there are a lot of people who are very interested in these kinds of questions, that they're going to be taking on these issues and questions directly. That being said, there also are a lot of very substandard, for example, engineering colleges and in parts of India where these standards are not routinely observed. And it's no accident, I think, that India has been one of the places where some of these predatory journals, in particular, one set of them have been created, and where there's been a lot of use of them. But there's been use in South Africa. There's been use in a lot of places where people have to pad their CVs in order to make it look like they're being very active. And the further you are from the center of major research, the more either desperate or ill-informed you are, and therefore you can be taken advantage of. So I think it's really critical to work with colleagues in India, and we have a collaboration with Tata and Sons in India, where we do a prize, and I want to talk to them as well about things we can do to help support the research environment around these ethical questions as well, since it's so important, I think, for our whole research environment across the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and as I said, I'm going to India soon, and I really look forward to talk to researchers there and see what their feedback is. And it really takes us back to the first questions that we discussed, which was the predatory journals and how people might end up working with those journals. There's a mixture of wanting to be published desperately or wanting to put their names out there and get their CV fill in their CV with some experience, but also a little bit of lack of maybe understanding of what's going on with open access and things like that. That seems to be very Euro and US centric at the moment, the big open access movement. So hopefully in the future, as soon as, this knowledge is become more global, then we might see the kind of demise of these predatory publishers and journals and outlets. Okay, so I have one last question for you, because I know that we covered basically all the possible topics on ethics and research integrity, but this last question is a bit more personal. So if you were to wake up tomorrow and you were still 18 and you had to start your college or university career again as an undergraduate, what subject would you study? First of all, would be the same, or would you change completely your direction? And would you still continue to work in academia, knowing what you know now and all the experiences you've had within the system?
Well, okay. Imagine a different life starting more or less now in terms of these decisions. As you know from reading the book, I kind of fell into the disciplines and the interests I had, partly because I was in fact taken to India by my family, as well as later taking my family with me when I was 12 years old. So it was a hugely impactful moment in my growing up, and I wanted to spend more time there and find out more about it, and it was fascinating to me. And that was in an age when it wasn't possible to just use a phone to call somebody there. It seemed a much further distance away from where I grew up on the East Coast of the United States than it does now. So that kind of drove me to do that. I'm still always interested in the history of things, and history is something that I read both, when I'm doing it for work and also when I'm doing it for play. But I will say that this whole domain now of AI is so interesting, and it brings together questions that I used to be interested in, like what is the nature of consciousness, what is the importance, what is the place of language, with also these questions about what is the future of our economy. Are we going to have full employment? Do we have to think differently about that? What is the potential downside in terms of bad actors? How do we deal with information, misinformation, disinformation? I think I probably would have tried to do something that connected with AI.
Okay.
I've done it then in the university. I've always loved being in the university. It's not quite as happy a place as it used to be, because there's so many funding pressures and so many political pressures. Yeah. But I guess I just can't think of a better thing to do or a place to do it than a university, even if, and I'll just say this to close, but even if the university becomes a little more like what I recommend at the end of my book, which is a little more open, more open for people to come in and leave and go off and do other things and then come back, so they don't have to just take a single track in decisions they make when they're 18, which would be my preference in answer to your question.
That's great. Thank you. Well, that's great to know that you want to go back to the same sort of environment. So it means that it's good. It's good. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I think this conversation was great. On my side, I could have gone on forever, but I promised to stay within the hour. So thank you again for joining us today for this episode. And for all of you that are watching or have watched the first a little bit of this live today, make sure that you tune in on the 28th of August for our second episode on patient engagement in the health science publishing with Nikki Greenholm. and I'll see you then. Thank you again, Professor Dirks, for today, and see you all next time.
Thank you, Francesca. It's great to have been with you.
Thank you. Bye.